All right. Well, I am so glad to be with you all tonight. As you know, KDC Grants has a lot of different cadres going on. So Wendy's got several happening tonight. She's taking care of another one. So I'm with you tonight. I'm Jackie Crosland, and I think Dr. Evans will be with us too. So you'll have some of your favorites on here, just not Wendy. I know we love Wendy, but tonight we do have a special guest with us, Sam Terry. And as I was preparing for your introduction, of course, I found this website, and I'm actually going to read this because it's such a great and interesting thing about our speaker tonight. So let me share this with you. Sam Terry IV, he's a native of Barron County, Kentucky, where his ancestors planted deep roots in helping settle the vast area known as the Barrens. He's a graduate of Transylvania, and he has served in a variety of leadership positions related to preserving and interpreting Kentucky's unique history. Sam Terry's Kentucky was created as an offshoot of Terry's popular newspaper column, My Kentucky, which celebrated the Commonwealth's 125th anniversary. What began as a simple social media page for Facebook friends has since evolved into a daily celebration of Kentucky's heritage, enjoyed by nearly 20,000 regular readers. That's impressive, Sam.
It's actually 30,000 now.
Oh, wow. You're going to have to update here. That's amazing. In recent years, he has researched and written entries for the Kentucky Humanities Council's initial series, Think History, broadcast on EKU's public radio station. He's been a presenter for the syndicated radio program, Our American Story, and the Uncommon History of the South podcast. Terry's passion for local and state history has made him a frequent speaker in classroom settings and for a wide variety of organizations. He served as president of the Barron County Historical Foundation, parent organization of the South Central Kentucky Cultural Center in Glasgow. He's a former president of the Barron County Historical Society, former chairman of Renaissance Main Street, Glasgow, and the Glasgow Historic Preservation Commission. On a broader level, Terry has served as president of the Kentucky Association of Museums, the Historical Confederation of Kentucky. In his home community, he continues to lead cemetery walking tours. This is why I continued on with the introduction, because this fascinated me and I thought I want to do that. Also student-oriented Civil War themed walking tours of Glasgow and numerous other programs. He's the author of Images of Glasgow, part of the Images of America book series. He also edited and published the memoirs of Nettie B.C. Depp, the well-known Southern educator. So Sam, thank you so much for being here with us today. And without any further ado, I'll let you get started.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you all. Can everybody hear okay?
I can. Looks like they can.
Okay, good. I am thrilled to be able to do this, and it's kind of an interesting thing. When Wendy initially contacted me, I thought, oh my goodness, she wants a lot of Kentuckians covered in a short period of time. So we negotiated a little bit to have some programs, a multiple number of programs focusing on people in Kentucky history, but not necessarily people who are the most well-known, famous Kentuckians. And when we think about history, I always immediately go back to a quote by Will Durant. And let's see if I can bring this up here. Are you all seeing that?
Not yet.
Just another way. Bear with me just a second.
Oh, you're fine. Brooke, I read your lips. She's like, that's fine.
Well, that's not wanting to share on the screen, but I'm going to tell you what it says regardless, instead of wasting your time. But this is a wonderful quote, and this is something that I draw on when I consider Kentucky history of any genre. And it's by Will Durant, who wrote The Story of Civilization. And he wrote, "Civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things historians usually record. Meanwhile, on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks." And that's what it's all about as we seek to share Kentucky's story with other people. Um, and it's not necessarily about what many of us might refer to as the Great White Fathers. It's not necessarily about Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln or Colonel Sanders, the very well-known people that are part of everyday lingo for a lot of people. And some of the folks that I've selected to talk about today that I think would be fascinating uh, for you all to include in history discussions in your classrooms. The first person would be Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. Is anybody familiar with Admiral Kimmel? Well, December 7th, and I selected him because of this being December the 7th. This was probably the worst day in his life. And that's because that Husband E. Kimmel was a native of Henderson County. He had grown up there and had become involved in the military. And just a few days before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, he had become the commander in chief of Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people don't realize that we had a Kentuckian who was at the very heart of that situation. And he was with a gentleman named Edward T. Layton, who very uh, uh, carefully wrote his reflection on that day. He was uh, observing what was going on December 7th with Kimmel. And he wrote, "Kimmel stood by the window of his office at the submarine base, his jaw set in stony anguish. As he watched the disaster across the harbor unfold with terrible fury, a spent 50 caliber machine gun bullet crashed through the glass. It brushed the admiral before it clanged to the floor. It cut his white jacket and raised a welt on his chest. Kimmel remarked to his communications officer, 'It would have been merciful if it had killed me.'" So obviously he realized if he is the commander in chief of this base and it's been attacked by the Japanese, uh, things are very serious, and we're probably going to be in the war, which we were. Ironically, just before this, Kimmel had warned American military officials that he felt Pearl Harbor was vulnerable to an attack, and he was ignored. And he was correct. He had a good idea of what was going to happen. 10 days later, the Roberts Commission, which had been appointed by President Roosevelt to investigate the attack on Pearl Harbor, determined that Kimmel and Army Lieutenant General Walter Short were both guilty of errors of judgment and dereliction of duty. And Kimmel was stripped of 2 of his 4 stars and, of course, lost his rank and privileges. He and Short were the only two uh, flag officers in World War II who were not retired at their highest rank in the Second World War. Uh, he was a victim of circumstance, very much so. And he spent the next 75 years attempting to clear his name. And his story's not very well known. Most people don't realize that we had a Kentuckian there in the center of that. Um, Historians, on the other hand, have said that it was actually um, a blessing that Kimmel had done nothing toward stopping the attack, because had he realized it was coming, he likely would have attempted to retaliate. He would have sent warships out into deep waters, and they would have just literally been sitting ducks and would have made the attack much worse than it actually was. The amazing thing to me is that we have had a number of presidents who've been lobbied to restore Kimmel's rank and his 4 stars. President Nixon, President Reagan, President Clinton all denied the request. Finally, in 1999, Congress passed a resolution to exonerate Kimmel and Short, restore both of those men to their full rank as the final 2 victims of Pearl Harbor. Now, what's really amazing is that to date, there still hasn't been a president who has chosen to act on that resolution. So Congress says that they can have their rank restored. We just haven't had a president who would do that. So in 2016, on the 75th anniversary of the attack of Pearl Harbor, Kimmel's hometown of Henderson, Kentucky, up on the Ohio River, dedicated a life-size bronze statue of him on the waterfront there in that community. He's standing there holding a pair of binoculars, looking out over the water. And meanwhile, tablets around that statue tell his story. But it was finally a little bit of recognition for this gentleman that he had done nothing wrong. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it changed his life forever. Needless to say. Are any of you familiar with Kimmel? But I think he's a person that students should know about. And if you look in our Kentucky history curriculum, you don't find anything about him. There's no mention of him in most sources. A second person that I wanted to talk a little bit about today is another educator, and an educator from the eastern portion of Kentucky, and that would be Cora Wilson Stewart. Cora Wilson Stewart, is that a name familiar to anyone? Yes, good. Cora Wilson Stewart is just a hero of mine. I have really enjoyed learning more of her story and finding more information about her. I've even tracked down a few family members of her. But Cora Wilson Stewart was a teacher in Rowan County near Moorhead, and the Moonlight School movement was her creation. And in 1911, she had the idea to create Moonlight Schools. And the concept was simply that you would have classes for adults in the community schoolrooms, but it was only held on nights that the moon was shining bright enough that you could walk to the school safely at night. And the goal was to teach people to read and write, because she had recognized that there were thousands of people in our country at that point who could not read, write, do basic arithmetic. In the first year in her home county, she had 1,200 adults come to Moonlight Schools. And the following year, that had grown to 1,600 students. Um, by 1915, most every county in the Commonwealth of Kentucky had adopted the Moonlight School concept in their local school districts, and 40,000 people have been taught to read and write by taking those nighttime classes on those nights. She became quite well known throughout the United States, and she was very innovative in the way she did all of her work there. She realized that adults were not interested in reading the same primer reading books that the students were having. They didn't want to read about uh, stories of play and child things, but instead, adults would want to read something that they related to. And in order to do that, she created her own textbook, and it was called the Country Life Reader. And it was filled with simple stories that she wrote about everyday things in rural life that people would relate to. And as if that weren't enough, she developed her own newspaper called the Rowan County Messenger. And it was written with the stories being composed with short sentences, simple words, and repetitive words, so that a new reader would be able to comprehend what was being conveyed in that newspaper. So World War One rolls around a couple of years later, and the selective service system in this country discovered that we had 700,000 men in the armed forces who could not read, nor could they write their names, which is kind of amazing to us in 2022. And so, to address the situation, she worked with the US military to create the Soldier's First Book. And it was aimed at teaching the recruits to read basic instructions for their service. And for example, things were like, why are we at war? The answer was to keep our country free, to keep other people free, to make the world safe to live in, to stop the rule of kings, to put an end to war. And this was such a huge success. States all across the country were picking up on Cora Wilson Stewart and this process that she had created for the US military, but also her Moonlight Schools that had started back in Kentucky. A favorite concept with her Moonlight Schools was that her only request was that the students who attended write her a letter after they had learned to write and to be able to read. And I have an example from 1914 of a student from Carrollton, Kentucky, and that student wrote, "I wish to thank you for the Moonlight Schools. I have been going 6 nights and I have learned to read and write. I am 43 years old and have written my first letter to my mother, the next to you, yours, Amanda McKinney." And Cora Wilson Stewart also served the education profession in Kentucky as well as the country. She was the first woman to be president of KEA, the Kentucky Education Association. And she was named the head of the Kentucky Literacy Commission by the governor at that time. She was on the National Literacy Crusade. And at one point, she was even nominated for President of the United States in San Francisco. She didn't win the nomination, of course, but she was indeed placed the nomination. One of the interesting things about her personal life is that she was married 3 times, twice to the same man, and divorced 3 times. And in one of those marriages, she had a child that died as an infant. And that sort of changed her perspective on everything in life. And she concluded that it was her mission in life to educate children and obviously adults as well. So uh, thankfully, she did that. The really sad thing about Cora Wilson Stewart's life is the end of it, because she moved to Tryon, North Carolina. She was penniless, had virtually nothing, and by that time she also had gone blind from glaucoma, which prevented her from uh, doing various things in the way of work. And so she died in 1958 at age 83 and is buried in Tryon, North Carolina. Just out of curiosity, I tracked down where she was buried, and it turns out that she did not have a tombstone at her grave, and that some of her former students found out about that. And so they put a very small stone there to commemorate her space. The other interesting aspect of that is that I learned that the people in Tryon, North Carolina didn't know what Cora Wilson Stewart had done or the significance of her life. They didn't even know she was a Kentuckian. And they were fascinated by all of this and excited that she was actually buried there. So there's a move underway in North Carolina to erect a historical marker at the cemetery where Cora Wilson Stewart is buried, so that people there can know more of her story. But as I'm sure you've guessed, this was the beginning of the adult education movement that took off and has expanded and grown in every direction since her time. Any questions about Cora?
I meant to tell you all at the beginning too, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll, talk about those, or you can unmute yourselves at times like these. But we do have Brooke put in there, we just went to her moonlight school yesterday. So how ironic, or I don't know if that's ironic, but coincidental is that?
Well, it is. And it gets back to the whole concept that history is everywhere around us in Kentucky. Kentucky is just so rich in its history. Other states don't have comparable stories to tell. And as you study Kentucky history, you realize that more and more all the time. And so it's a wonderful blessing that we have. And it's also wonderful to be able to bring about the subjects of people like Cora Wilson Stewart and Husband Kimmel that you don't necessarily find in a school textbook. So it takes an innovative teacher to find ways to bring those stories to light. For the next person I thought I would talk to you a little bit about today, we go to the central part of the state. So these are hopping around all over the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Anybody familiar with King Solomon? Not the one in the Bible.
That's all I know, yeah.
Well, there was a gentleman in Lexington by the name of William King Solomon, and he became the hero of Lexington in 1833, died in 1854. But William King Solomon went by King. He was born in Virginia, and he claimed that he and Henry Clay were born just a short distance apart, and that they played together as boys in Virginia. And he used to jest that his work as a digger of cellars and cisterns was less elevated than Henry Clay's work as a statesman in the US Congress. And he was totally committed to anything that Henry Clay was involved in. He was his hero. And there's one occasion where one of Clay's opponents in an election had offered King Solomon some libation on an election day in exchange for his vote. And after the election, the candidate asked if he had voted as agreed, and Solomon's reply was, you may have been foolish enough to try to bribe me, but I'm not foolish enough to vote for you. So a clever fellow. So Solomon had a problem with addiction. He was the town drunk, was the other part of King Solomon's story in Lexington. His wife died, his only child ran away from home. He basically lived on the edges of the streets and in the gutters in Lexington, and they nicknamed him King Solomon. And by 1833, uh, the local judge in Lexington, just trying to do something with William King Solomon because he had been in court so many times for drunkenness, was he ordered him sold as a servant for a 9-month period. And Solomon's purchaser was about the least likely person you could imagine. He was bought by a person whose name we know only as Aunt Charlotte. And Aunt Charlotte was a free Black woman. This is 1833. And she had known Solomon and Henry Clay as a child back in Virginia also. And she had been freed by her owners when they got to Kentucky. And her means of supporting herself was selling pies and baked goods on the streets of Lexington. And so she had a brisk business and she had amassed a little bit of money. So at Solomon's auction, ordered by the Lexington judge, 2 of the bidders happened to be students at Transylvania Medical College. And they were bidding on Solomon because they viewed him as near the end of his life, and they were looking for a future cadaver for their medical research. So that's an interesting twist on things. Aunt Charlotte was the other bidder for Solomon, and her exact bid is a little bit of a mystery. Some sources say that she paid 13 cents for him to work for her for 9 months. Others claim it was $13, and even some others maintain it was 50 cents. Whatever the price, King Solomon, the white vagrant, became the property of Aunt Charlotte, the free Black woman. And that set in motion one of the most incredible tales in Kentucky history. So Solomon woke up in a drunken stupor, and to his dismay, all of Lexington was in an uproar. Carriages were everywhere, wagons were filled with furnishings, and people were scattered around. And what had happened was the Asiatic cholera had broken out in Lexington. And the Asiatic cholera is a pretty serious disease. It is passed along in water supply, and it just happened that Lexington had a series of heavy rainfalls at this time in 1833. All of the sewers overflowed in Lexington, and they flowed into the town branch, which if you read the Lexington paper occasionally, you'll still see references to town branch. And this is the same body of water. So town branch became infested with the cholera virus that was transmitted through fecal matter. And a single bucket of contaminated water was deadly enough that it could wipe out an entire family. So naive people were unaware of the contamination, and they just kept getting sick, and more people were dying. And what was happening in Lexington was everybody was trying to evacuate if they possibly could, including Aunt Charlotte. And she left Solomon there to fend for himself. A lot of people sort of chuckled about Solomon staying because he never got sick. And so, of course, the joke in town was that, well, he didn't get sick because all of his internal organs were basically pickled from all the alcohol he had consumed for so many years. But in reality, everybody left. There were over 500 people in Lexington that died, and there were only 6,000 people living in Lexington at the time. So a nice chunk of the population. What was happening is no one stayed to bury these bodies. And so bodies were stacked by the streets. They were just simply wrapped in their bedclothes because everything was contaminated with the Asiatic cholera. You didn't want to be handling that. So people were literally put out in their bed sheets, whatever they happened to be on when they died of this disease. King Solomon became the hero of Lexington because he looked around and wondered, well, what do I do? Well, he fell back to what he did as a profession. He was digging cellars and cisterns. And so he started digging graves. And down on 3rd Street in downtown Lexington is the old burying ground. And he hauled all of these dead bodies from downtown Lexington to that graveyard, dug their graves for all of them, and properly buried them. No coffins, of course, because there was no one in town to build a coffin. Everyone else had evacuated. And so when people realized that King Solomon had stayed in Lexington and had buried their family members, their neighbors, and their friends, he truly became the hero of Lexington. And then fast forward about 60 years, James Lane Allen, one of our wonderful Kentucky authors, uh, wrote about King Solomon, and he told the story in his book that is entitled Flute and Violin and Other Stories of Old Kentucky. And as a result, King Solomon's story became known. Uh, Ironically, when he died in 1854, he was buried in a space that somebody just happened to have and felt sorry for him, provided it's only a few feet from Henry Clay's mausoleum. So the two boys are back together in the Lexington Cemetery. And in 1908, a large monument was placed there at his grave, and people still flocked to see King Solomon's gravesite because he was the hero of Lexington. There are a lot of other things that came about because of that whole cholera epidemic in Lexington. One, it left so many children um, without a parent. And so Maria Cecil Gratz, the Gratzes of Gratz Park in downtown Lexington, was from Philadelphia originally, and she had the idea of starting an orphanage. She was from a very wealthy household, and people realized that. And so all of these people were bringing these orphan children to her front door, hoping that she would take pity on them and know how to help these children whose parents had died in the epidemic. And thus was started the Lexington Orphanage, which was the first orphanage in Kentucky. And so it's an ongoing story. That organization actually still exists in downtown Lexington, which is rather amazing. So, any questions about King Solomon? Well, I think it's a great story, and I think it's one that students could learn a lot from. Not only do you learn local history, you get some biology in there as well, and local customs. And if you are interested in more detailed information, um, there is a book that's relatively new that Terry Foody wrote, and that last name is spelled Foody, and it's called The Pie Seller, the Drunk, and the Lady, the Heroes of the 1833 Cholera Epidemic in Lexington, Kentucky. And other communities in Kentucky had similar epidemics. Um, Bowling Green had a cholera epidemic. Glasgow did. Campbellsville, I think. Various communities. It was not anything that people could escape from, but a fascinating thing. Okay,
Roger said Cynthiana also had a cholera outbreak too.
Cynthiana. What was the
Yes,
town?
Cynthiana.
Cynthiana. It was rather common, and it was horrible. I know in the instance in Glasgow, the cholera was brought to town by a traveling circus, and one of the circus performers had it, happened to die in the hotel, and the same situation. The contaminated water was flowing into the town spring where everyone got their drinking water, and so they were just reinfecting everyone with this cholera. So it also wiped out a number of people. So another person that I want to talk to you about, maybe the least known of all these people. Uh, Anybody familiar with the name Nettie Depp? DEPP. Well, before anybody asks, I can tell you that she is Johnny Depp's great great aunt, and an interesting story about her life. You wouldn't think that she would become a person well known in Kentucky. She's from here where I'm from, and I will have to admit that Nettie Depp is also my great great aunt, and I edited and wrote her biography a long time ago. But she was a school teacher, and I think this is a story that educators in particular would find fascinating, and especially when you get to the modern twist at the end. Um, she had decided that she wanted to be a teacher. She went out west for a while, where her sister's family had moved, taught in Wacomas, Oklahoma, decided to come back to Kentucky, and she got really serious about her own education because the Cherry brothers, anybody in the group go to Western Kentucky University by chance? No Hilltoppers? Well, Henry Hardin Cherry was the founder of what became Western Kentucky University. It just so happened that Nettie was teaching school. This is going to be familiar to a lot of people. She was teaching school the 2 semesters, and then in the summer, she would go to summer school. And so she would trek to Bowling Green, Kentucky. She would study under Henry Hardin Cherry and his brother T.C. Cherry. And she became quite a devotee of everything that Henry Hardin Cherry believed and taught in training teachers. And the basic concept of that is that he and she believed that education was the engine that advanced society. If we can educate people more and improve people through education, society will improve. And she continued teaching school, but in 1913, she had this crazy idea, seems to us anyway, but maybe not to her, or maybe she thought it was crazy too. She decided that she was going to run for county school superintendent. Now, in the early 1900s in Kentucky, uh, your school superintendent was elected just like your sheriff and your county clerk and your county judge. They were a county official. They were not necessarily people who had any training in education. Uh, they were the most popular. So she decided that if she ran for county school superintendent, that she could have an impact on Kentucky education, specifically in Barron County, Kentucky. Now, keep in mind, women couldn't vote yet in 1913. So this is 7 years before she could even cast a vote for herself on the ballot. So she had to rely on getting men to vote for her. And she campaigned, and she wrote in her memoirs that uh, She forced herself to think and speak as a man because she wanted to be able to relate to them. And she was no nonsense about education. Her biggest complaint had been that the sheriff and the judge would not enforce the compulsory attendance law and make parents send their children to public school. Well, crazy thing, November 1913, she wins the election. So she was the first woman to ever run for office in her county. She was the first woman elected to public office and to serve in public office. And so she became the county school superintendent. Her reports to the superintendent of public education are fascinating and really remind us all the things that educators in the early part of the 20th century went through to practice their profession. Uh, she incidentally had 136 one-room schools that she was overseeing, which is mind-boggling to me that she could do that. In her report, for example, in 1914-15, she noted that she had built 6 new schoolhouses, one with 4 rooms and 2 halls, had repaired 15 other schoolhouses. She had gotten several water wells put down, built a number of outhouses. One of her concerns was the African American children of the county, because the population was so mobile. They moved from farm to farm as sharecroppers in most cases. And she lamented that she wished that she could put the schoolhouses on wheels and take them where the students were to make it easier for them to attend school. She was the first to write and enforce a curriculum for all of the county schools. And she thought that teachers needed to follow that. She wanted all the students across the area to have the same education and be exposed to the same things. She did things like introduce school libraries to the schools, music classes, art classes, all of those things she instituted. She also formed the county's first 4-year high school. If you were a student in Kentucky and you could pass the 8th grade examination, you could be a Kentucky school teacher. No further training was required. So you had a lot of people who I'm sure had no business being a school teacher, but they were. And this was Kentucky in that era. And so 8th grade, you were finished. There weren't a lot of public high schools, and you had to go to another city that had a high school if you wanted a 4-year diploma. So she created that. And when she left office after 4 years, she had ironically paid off all of her predecessors' debts. So the school system was debt-free, and all the schoolhouses were in good repair. And she said that she was pleased to hand over the keys with no further impediment to education. And the reason she didn't run for re-election, both the political parties wanted her to run as their candidate. And her response to that was that she had made it clear all along that if she ran again, she would run in the name of education and not under a political party's banner, that politics did not need to be a part of public education. And so you can tell she was pretty progressive for that day. She later went on to become principal of a high school in Scottsville, Kentucky, also in Cave City, died at age 56 of breast cancer. So that's the basis of her story. Did some interesting things. She was not necessarily a statewide person at all. She was a part of a group of women in 1913 that all ran for their county school superintendents positions. And 26 others besides her won those elections the same day. So there was a sea change because women were teachers and they were coming out of the classroom and saying, we know more about educating these children. We've done this day in and day out. So we're going to help our school system. And that was exactly what they did. So you got all of that story. Fast forward to several years ago, and the Historic Properties Advisory Commission for the Commonwealth of Kentucky that maintains the Kentucky State Capitol decided that they wanted some way to add a statue of a woman to the Kentucky State Capitol. And that could be a very controversial thing. Well, who's the most famous? Who accomplished the most? And this group said, we're not really worried about putting somebody in the rotunda. We just want a woman represented somewhere in the state capitol. We have hundreds of thousands of school children walk these halls every year, and they can't find anything that's of a woman in this building. And so they determined that they would do research and find a representative woman. Well, lo and behold, the person they selected was Nettie Depp as a representative of all Kentucky women. And so just 3 weeks ago, the bronze statue of Nettie Depp was unveiled in the west entrance lobby of our state capitol. And it was a touching thing to be there, to hear our lieutenant governor, who of course is an educator, and say, finally her little girl could come to the Capitol and leave having learned something of a woman, and what better woman to have than an educator, because they have certainly impacted all of Kentucky's history. So make a point, if you go to Frankfort, run by the Capitol and see Nettie Depp's bronze statue there. You'll be impressed. Finally, one other person I wanted to mention today. She should be so famous in Kentucky and groundbreaking. It's another woman, and this time an African-American woman. And Alberta O. Jones is her name. Anybody familiar with Alberta Jones? It's a fascinating story. She was academically precocious. She had gone to Louisville Central High School before enrolling in the Louisville Municipal College, which was an all-Black college in Louisville at that time, and it later merged with the University of Louisville. And she attended the University of Louisville Law School and eventually transferred to Howard University School of Law, graduating at the top of her class. So young African-American female comes back. She was the first woman to pass the Kentucky bar exam in 1959. She was the first woman prosecutor in Kentucky in 1964. And she was Louisville's first Black prosecutor. And at the beginning of her career, there was a young man in Louisville who she thought needed some guidance and someone to look over his shoulder and keep things in line for him and his best interest. That young man was Cassius Clay, and she became an attorney for young Cassius Clay. She's the person who took him to California to negotiate, to train under Archie Moore. She was also the lawyer representing Cassius Clay, negotiating with the 11 millionaires that were putting together a contract known as the Louisville Sponsoring Group to make him the professional boxer that he became. Such a wonderful thing that she did for him is she insisted that a minimum of 15% of his earnings had to be held in trust until he was 35, and she was the co-trustee because she wanted him to end up having something for his boxing career. She was also very passionate about civil rights, and she protested in the Washington March in 1963, came back to Louisville, and was so excited that she formed the Independent Voters Association of Louisville. And her goal with that group was to register thousands of African Americans to be able to vote. One of the things she encountered was that so many of the thousands of people she was getting registered to vote didn't know how to vote. They weren't sure what to do when they got inside the voting booth. Alberta brilliantly rented voting machines and held practice sessions for newly registered voters to come, become familiar with the voting machine, and know how to select their choice and mark their ballot. And it made a huge impact in Louisville. Unfortunately, at perhaps her prime, we will never know. In August of 1965, she was murdered. And there were two witnesses that saw two males dragging a screaming woman from a car, and it just happened to be a Ford Fairlane, which was what Alberta was driving at that time. And they eventually found her body in the Ohio River, and she had been bludgeoned to death with concrete block. Amazingly, here in 2022, that's still an unsolved murder in Kentucky. We don't talk about it too much, do we? But it should be talked about. And we'll never know all the things that she could have accomplished in her life. But what a great example of a Kentuckian doing some unusual things and truly history-making things that young people and old people need to know about. Any questions or comments about Alberta or any of these other people?
I don't see any pop up just yet about Alberta. That's fascinating. But Jennifer wanted to know if Solomon ever sobered up in his later life.
You know, I don't know. That's a little bit of a mystery. Perhaps he did. Let's hope he did.
Debbie asked if there was a book about Alberta.
There is not, to my knowledge. There should be. It would be a wonderful project for a graduate student or professor or historian to take on to chronicle her story. About the only thing you'll find publicly about Alberta is a banner on one of the banks in downtown Louisville that has her picture on it as a hero. One of her great quotes was that people told her that she could never succeed because she had two strikes against her. One was that she was a woman. Two was that she was Negro. And her response was, well, I happen to know that you get 3 strikes and I have 1 strike left. So I'm going to play as long as I can because I think I can hit a home run. And very, very inspiring young woman.
A question. So she was murdered during the civil rights movement, and how old was she?
Just a second. She was 35. So she had a full life ahead of her. So it seems like most of these people are folks that you may not have known about, but they are people that could be incorporated into classroom units. on Kentucky history, African American history. They come from all over the state, so all geographic areas are somewhat covered. It's hard to get every single region in Kentucky, but we certainly can try that. And, and I hope that is helpful to you.
Anybody else have questions? And feel free to unmute if you'd like to just ask your question. Jennifer said they take a field trip to the Capitol in the spring. She'll have to tell her kids about Miss Step and look for a statue on her field trip. I remember, I mean, this wasn't that long ago. I remember the news story, but I did keep wondering about Martha Lane Collins too. That'd be a good choice.
Absolutely. It was a long process for that group to come up with this idea. And I think the idea in the bigger picture is that she will be there for a period of time, and then that statue will go out into the state for display somewhere else, and another woman will be brought into the Capitol, so that every few years there's a rotation of a woman's statue, so that every portion of the state is represented and different professions and that sort of thing. But I do know that this took 3 different governors' administrations to finally get the statue in the Capitol. It was a long process. I think it started with Governor Steve Beshear and not completed as he had intended during his administration. Then Governor Bevin wanted to continue that, and that didn't happen during his administration. So finally, it did in Governor Andy Beshear's administration.
We do have just a few more minutes. If anyone has a question, Sam, we really appreciate you being with us today.
Well, I hope this is helpful. I hope
Very
it's
interesting.
information that is adaptable. And if you have suggestions, I think we're going to visit one another again next month, and we'll have a whole different set of subjects and so forth. So hopefully you find something that is a benefit there.
Great. Anyone, a lot of people are saying thank you for sharing.
It's wonderful. Well, I think it's always nice when you can learn about new people. And, you know, one of the things that I do with Sam Terry's Kentucky, and I think is what makes it interesting to people, and that started out as a Facebook situation, and it was never really with a plan. It just kept happening. And I share things on the anniversary date of some significance, not necessarily in chronological order. My feeling for a long time has been that people get bogged down learning history because we always do it in chronological order, and we get stuck on an area that may not be of interest to someone, and they lose interest as a result, and you never quite get all of the picture. So what I do is I tie all of those pieces that I do there with a calendar date, so that there's pretty much at least one story for every one of the 365 days on the calendar, and they skip around from centuries.
We did have a question. Can we get a list of those that you talked about tonight? I listed Admiral Husband Kimmel, Cora Wilson Stewart, Nettie Depp, and Alberta O. Jones. Did I miss anybody?
King Solomon.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And you're welcome to contact me if you want more information about those people. Obviously, I'm just giving you a thumbnail version of that.
What's your email?
You can email me at STERRY at Glasgow, GLASGOW hyphen KY.com. That's it.
Okay, thank you all very much. If there are no further questions, I want to say thank you for being here, and thank you, Sam, again for the interesting stories. And we look forward to learning more about some other folks from Kentucky.
I will look forward to it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you.
We got getting a lot of thank yous on the way out. And one thank you we. Mindy asked if there was a link. So if you don't mind sending that to Wendy, she'll get that out to, session evaluation. Wendy's
Yeah.
going to tell me.
Yeah,